The Black Pistons were started by Jeff Fort and Eugene Bull or King Ball Hairston. Jeff Fort was born on February 20, 1947 in Aberdeen, Mississippi. Jeff Fort's family migrated to Chicago along with many other black families. Jeff's father, John Lee Fort, obtained a job at a steel-producing factory on the south side of Chicago. Therefore, Jeff Fort and his 10 brothers and sisters moved up north. They moved into an apartment at 6536 South Blackstone Avenue in the Woodlawn area. At that time in the 1950s, there were more whites than blacks in that neighborhood. However, whites were moving out rapidly due to white flight. In 1959, at the age of 12, Jeff Fort formed a small clique of boys that acted as a gang on either the corner of 64th and Blackstone or 66th and Blackstone. There were about 10 members of the gang of young boys. They battled against gangs of white youths in the Woodlawn community and some other black gangs as well. Jeff Fort's crew consisted of kids that knew each other from the neighborhood or from the Audie Home, which is a Cook County Temporary Juvenile Detention Center, and the St. Charles Little IDOC. In 1960, when Jeff Fort was 13 years old, he was fighting with a local rival gang known as the Blackstone Raiders, not Rangers, from 70th Street, headed by Eugene Bull Hairston. The Raiders were older boys and Hairston was older than Fort. Hairston was a very tough gang leader that used his muscle. Fort's gang and Hairston's made a truce and merged their gangs to become the Blackstone Rangers. Back in the early 60s, Jeff Fort's nickname was Angel because he smoothed any Ranger problems over. The Rangers were a small-time gang in the early 60s that engaged in petty criminal activities such as vandalism, shoplifting, and common thuggery. One thing important to know is that this time Eugene Hairston was the leader of the Blackstone Rangers while Jeff Fort was second in command. By 1964, the Rangers began to recruit in heavy numbers because of the heavily growing Devil's Disciples. In 1965, the Rangers met with Reverend John Fry. Reverend Fry helped the Rangers receive federal funding to help the organization develop. At that same point in time, the Rangers were growing in numbers greatly. Reverend John Fry helped to guide Fort and Hairston on becoming a street gang government structure. He advised them on how to organize and collect government funding in order to greatly expand their empire. Hairston mainly commanded the older Stones while Fort mainly headed the young Stones. In 1966, Fort and Harrison met with a group of gang leaders that headed different gangs that were rivals of the Rangers. The two offered the gang leaders a truce and to also form a council. The council would be named the Main 21. This meant that all the gangs would unite into one alliance. They named the alliance the Black Pistone Nation, or BPSN for short. This alliance is very similar to the People Nation that exists today. Each gang within the Main 21 BPSN was a brick in the 21 brick pyramid. The top stone or brick was the Blackstone Rangers. Power was more or less shared among the bricks. However, if one of the other Main 21 council members developed a massive amount of power, they would mysteriously end up murdered and replaced. This is also how the first stone symbol was adopted, which is the 21 brick pyramid. On June 6, 1966, Eugene Hairston was sent to prison on drug charges. In the infancy of the BPSN, they had not become able to run a gang with a leader behind bars. Therefore, Jeff Fort became the new and undisputed leader of the BPSN at the age of 19 on the streets. However, there was still a promise made to Hairston to reclaim his throne when he was to be released. In 1968, Hairston's top spiritual leader, Paul Martin, aka Prophet Paul, was executed by the Rangers, which enabled Fort to take the throne. Also in 1968, Hairston was released from prison and managed to regain some of the nation back under his wing because much of the BPSN was Hairston followers, especially the Titanic Stone branch. Later in that same year, Hairston ordered 6 14-year-old Rangers to kill David Barksdale, who was head of the Black Disciples. He paid them $1 apiece to commit the murder. As Barksdale exited a bar that 1968 night, he was shot 6 times by the 6 Rangers but survived the attack, later dying from the gunshot wounds 6 years later in 1974. In the late 60s, the BPSN grew into incredible power for that point in time. They organized into a mob. They were at heavy odds with the Disciple Nation or Devil's Disciples and the Gangster Nation that was once Stones. In order to war better with Disciples and others, Fort and his mob needed money and guns. Therefore, to the public eye, Jeff Fort was able to disguise his mob as a group of do-gooders that were a charitable group raising money to help the community. The Stones also used extortion tactics to extract money from small business owners by threatening violence if the store owners ignore the charity set up by Stones. Gang apologists and liberal politicians fell for it and helped Fort raise money for his organization from the federal government. In 1969, Jeff Fort was invited to the inauguration of President Richard Nixon. Fort did not attend, but sent one of his men and also Henry Cogwell to it. The BPSN successfully were put on the federal government payroll system. In 1968, the federal government found some suspicious activities within a job training program headed by the Stones. In 1968, Fort began to beef with Fred Hampton and the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were trying to gain influence in Jeff Fort's neighborhood, and this angered Fort. He then threatened that he would start killing Panthers if they didn't leave. In December of 1968, Fred Hampton visited Fort at his headquarters to discuss the matter. Jeff Fort showed his power to Hampton by snapping his fingers, and 100 Stones came out with shotguns, machine guns, and other guns or weapons. Fred Hampton was then shown the power that Fort had on the streets even at his young age of 21. The Stones had already killed the Panther before this meeting. That was how the beefing began. After a while of talking, Hampton agreed to pull Panther influence out of Stone territory. The Stones waged into bloody gang wars from 1966 to 1968 with the Disciples and the Gangsters. In the early 1970s, the federal government was beginning to close in on Jeff Fort. As I mentioned earlier, in 1968 the federal government began investigating Fort and the Stones for misuse of government funding. The government had given the Stones $900,000 to $1.4 million for the job training program, and now their investigations began to discover how Jeff Fort was mismanaging government funds for illegal activities. In 1971, John Fry stepped down from advising the BPSN. In 1972, Jeff Fort and some others were brought up on charges for mismanaging government funds from the government. He was then sentenced to time at Statesville Prison until 1974. In 1974, he was transferred to Leavenworth Prison until 1976. All funding to the BPSN was then shut down, but it was too late. The BPSN had already established great power and had profited from the money they received in the 1960s. The BPSN had already taken the money they received and turned it into more money. Now that the BPSN was heavily developed, Jeff Fort was able to remain the undisputed leader even while incarcerated in Leavenworth Prison. While Fort was imprisoned, Mickey Cogwell, leader of the Cobra Stones, later known as Mickey Cobras, was leading the BPSN on the street. In 1974, Fort placed Thunder in charge of the Statesville Stones, and Hairston was running the Stones in Menard. By 1974, Hairston was up for parole. Therefore, he decided to send word to the Titanics that he was going to be released and to have some soldiers ready for a complete takeover of Jeff Fort and regain the BPSN into Hairston's favor. Several supporters were awaiting the parole of Hairston, mainly all from the Titanic Stone branch. Hairston's parole was denied, and that was when Mickey Cogwell was able to seize control of the BPSN and cause more Hairston supporters to follow Fort. This meant that those supporters that were awaiting Hairston's return were attacked by Fort Stones, which caused a brief bloody gang war mainly between the Titanics and the rest of the BPSN. This caused some Titanic Stone leaders to get incarcerated. Statesville and Menard then fell under total control of Jeff Fort. In 1975, Eugene Hairston King Bull was released from prison after being incarcerated for the solicitation of the attempted murder of David Barksdale back in 1968. Right after his release, Hairston set up a small crew of Stones on 70th and Paxton, which was where Hairston was taking residence. One day he left his apartment to go to the cleaners on 71st when two men jumped out of a car and shot Hairston 3 times. Hairston fled to the cleaners and called for help. Hairston survived the attack, then moved to the north side of Chicago where he set up the North Side BPS. This is the story of how we have Stones on the north side of Chicago. When Jeff Fort was released on March 12, 1976, he traveled to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where he tried to convert to Islam and join the Moorish Science Temple. However, they would not accept him. Fort then started his own temple. In April 1976, Jeff Fort merged the BPSN into new Islamic beliefs that he adopted when he was in prison. He adopted the title of Rukn that came from a book that was describing shrines in Mecca. This is the birth of the eye, crescent moon, and five-pointed star. The five-point star then was used on the streets, but strictly as a Rukn symbol until 1978, when it also began to be used as the People Nation symbol. There was much objection to the new Islamic order. Mickey Cogwell, who was leading the Cobra Stones, objected the most. Mickey Cogwell spoke up and objected at this meeting house at the camp, which was at 4233 South Indiana Avenue. Even after Fort threatened anyone that spoke up at the meeting would be killed. On February 25, 1977, Mickey Cogwell was killed, and it was rumored that Fort had killed him. The Black P. Stone gang was still in existence, but mainly led by Eugene Hairston and others. The Rukns were only for strong supporters of Fort. All Rukn members had to adopt the suffix of L within their last name. This proved to be a massive problem because authorities were able to go on computer systems in the late 70s and 80s and find Rukn members easily and red flag them. On April 14, 1978, Fort organized the L Pyramid Maintenance and Management Corporation, which made it possible to purchase a piece of property at 3945 to 3959 South Drexel that used to be known as Oakland Square Theater. When it was run by Rukns, it became known as Rukn Grand Major Temple of America, also known as the Fort. It stayed standing until June of 1990, when it was torn down. In 1978, Jeff Fort organized the People Nation because organization of gang wars was needed on the streets. The war would then just be people against folk. Jeff Fort invited a few gangs into the People Alliance in 1978, which included Latin Kings, Vice Lords and their factions, Mickey Cobras, Latin Counts, Bishops, Spanish Lords, and the Insane Unknowns. In the early 80s, the invitation extended to more street gangs. In 1983, Jeff Fort was arrested and sentenced to 13 years in prison for his connection to a large shipment of drugs in Mississippi. While he was incarcerated, he continued to run the gang. There was even a pilgrimage to Mecca scheduled, and the destination was Libya. In Libya, Fort's top lieutenants made contact with Prime Minister Gaddafi, who was an enemy to the United States. During the late spring of 1986, Rukns made 2 trips to Panama City, Panama, to meet with Libyan delegates. They worked out a deal with the Libyans to exchange $2.5 million and an asylum in Tripoli for some high-powered weapons. When the Rukns were going to get the weapons, they were going to launch a wide-scale urban assault on the police and other government institutions, which was to be Operation Rukn. Fort was then tried on terrorist charges. Then in 1987, Fort was sentenced to 80 years in prison. In another round of convictions, Fort was tried for murder charges in 1988 and sentenced to 75 more years in prison, along with 50 other high-ranking members. In 1988, the Rukn name disappeared and the Black P. Stone name reappeared. This name change was also made possible after Eugene Hairston was gunned down outside the Ida B. Wells housing projects in 1988. In 1991 to present day, the BPS has experienced inter-alliance wars with the Mickey Cobras and Vice Lords. BPS still maintains good ties to other people gangs, except 2 gangs, mainly Vice Lords and MCs. However, in parts of the city, MCs and BPS are good friends, and some VL factions get along with Stones too.